The label came before the question. Just a nurse. It was said casually, like it explained everything about her. Enough to dismiss, enough to move on. No one asked what kind, no one needed to, because in that room they already thought they understood her place, and she didn't correct them. If you've ever been defined too quickly by others, type more than that below. The bar near the base had the particular ease of a place where people feel entitled to be themselves. Off-duty hours in a space full of people who share a general context. The same base, the same general orbit of work and consequence, tend to produce a specific kind of social openness. Guards come down. The formal structures that govern interaction during working hours relax into something more casual, more direct, more willing to make assessments and state them without the procedural caution that professional environments require. People say what they think in the way people say what they think when they're not worried about the consequences of being heard. She had come in without ceremony, around 35, dressed simply, nothing that announced a role or a rank or a reason for being in a space like this one. She had taken a seat at the edge of one of the larger gatherings with the comfortable self-containment of someone who doesn't need to announce her arrival to feel settled in a place. She ordered. She didn't initiate conversation. The group around her had been there longer. They were loud in the easy way of people who have finished something demanding and are in the process of letting the day decompress. Voices overlapping, stories building on stories, the particular social energy of a group that is comfortable enough with each other to perform for each other without it feeling like performance. They were military. That was clear from the context, from the vocabulary, from the specific texture of the things they talked about, and the shorthand they used to talk about them. One of them noticed her. It was the natural noticing of someone in a social space registering a new presence at its edge. Not targeted, not particularly interested, just the reflexive social awareness that produces an acknowledgement when a person nearby falls within your field of attention. He said something inclusive, the kind of easy opener that groups use to bring peripheral people into the conversation without requiring them to have earned it. She answered his question, told him what she did. The word nurse landed in the group the way words land when they're processed through a filter that was already in place. Quickly, cleanly, without friction, because it fit a category the filter had ready for it. The conversation didn't stop. Nobody was rude about it. There was simply a brief, visible recalibration of the attention the group had been about to allocate, and then the attention went elsewhere, toward the parts of the conversation that felt more relevant to the people having it. She had given them one word. They had built a complete picture from it, her role, her context, her relationship to the things they were discussing, her place in the room relative to theirs. The picture was assembled in the span of a second, without questions, without the kind of follow-up that would have complicated it. She didn't add anything. She let the picture stand. Not because it was accurate, because she already knew that correcting it in this room, in this moment, before anything had happened to make the correction necessary, would cost more than it would return. The conversation moved the way conversations move in groups like this one, through the specific geography of shared experience, stopping at the landmarks that everyone present had visited and understood. Deployments, missions, the field, not as an abstraction, but as a physical place that had specific textures and specific demands, that produced specific kinds of problems and required specific kinds of responses. They talked about it the way people talk about something they know from the inside, with the compressed, referential shorthand that only works between people who share the context it assumes. She sat at the edge of it, not excluded. The opener had been genuine, and the group wasn't hostile, but the calibration had been made. She had been assigned a place in the conversation's architecture that was roughly equivalent to her assigned place in the room, present, acknowledged, not particularly central. The conversations that passed near her were not directed at her, and the ones she could have contributed to moved past before the contribution would have been natural. She listened. The listening had a quality that was different from polite attention. It wasn't the surface-level monitoring that people do when they're in a conversation that doesn't require their full engagement. The partial processing that keeps you present enough to respond if addressed, while your actual attention is elsewhere. It was the focused, absorptive listening of someone who is extracting specific information from what they're hearing and filing it against a framework that has a lot of existing structure to receive it. She understood what they were talking about, more than they had assigned her the capacity to understand. And more specifically, in the cases where the understanding mattered, more accurately. One of the group was telling a story about a field incident, the details drawn from memory and shaped in the retelling toward the elements that made it a good story rather than the elements that made it a technically complete account. Part of the story involved a medical response. The details of that response were described in terms that reflected what a non-specialist remembers about a medical situation rather than what actually happened, which is a normal and completely understandable gap when the person telling the story is not the person who made the medical decisions. But the gap was there. She registered the specific point where the account diverged from what the account would have looked like if the details had been drawn from clinical knowledge rather than observation memory, and noted the difference with the automatic, involuntary recognition of someone for whom the correct version of that information is not a fact to be recalled, but a framework so deeply embedded it parses incoming data against itself without requiring conscious effort. She didn't correct it. The biggest mistake isn't what people say, it's what they assume without asking. If you've ever been underestimated, type "not that simple" below. Not because the correction wasn't available, not because the error was harmless in all possible contexts. In a retelling, among people who would never apply the details operationally, the gap didn't have consequences. But the social math of the moment was clear. A correction offered from her position in the room's architecture would have been received through the filter that had already been applied to her. It would have been heard as the kind of overreach that people who have been assigned a peripheral role make when they want to seem more central than they are. The timing wasn't right. She settled back and let the story finish. The door opened on the far side of the bar, and the room's ambient energy shifted in the specific way it shifts when people who carry a particular kind of weight enter a space. It wasn't a dramatic change. No conversation stopped. No heads turned with the synchronized attention of people responding to a single stimulus. It was subtler than that, the distributed, unconscious recalibration that groups make when the composition of their environment has changed in a way that their social instincts have registered before their conscious minds have caught up. The room continued its business, but something in the room had adjusted. 4 men, dressed without distinguishing markers, the way people dress when they have stopped needing markers to know who they are and stopped caring whether other people can read them from the outside. They moved without urgency and without any of the expansive social energy that most people bring to the entrance of a public space. They came in the way people come in when they are somewhere for a reason that isn't the place itself. The one in front scanned the room. It was a quick scan, the kind that takes in a space in a single organized pass, rather than the slower, more curious survey of someone exploring an environment. The kind that is looking for something specific and knows how to find it efficiently. It moved across the room with the clean, systematic quality of a process rather than an impulse, through the groups near the entrance, across the bar, past the larger gatherings, to the edges of the space. It stopped at her. Not the hesitant stop of recognition that isn't fully certain, the clean stop of recognition that is. He had found what he was looking for, and the finding had taken him approximately the same amount of time it had taken the group she was sitting near to assign her a role and stop paying attention to her. He crossed the room without detour. The group around her registered his approach in the way groups register the approach of someone who isn't coming toward them, which produces the particular awkwardness of people who are suddenly aware that their previous assumptions about the relative importance of the elements in their immediate environment may have been incorrectly distributed. He didn't verify, didn't ask, "Are you the one we're looking for?" or produce any version of the confirmation request that the situation might have seemed to call for. He had done whatever verification the situation required before he walked through the door. What was left was the thing itself, stated simply and without preamble. "We've been looking for you." 5 words. The group absorbed them in silence. Not the silence of people who didn't understand what was being said, the silence of people who were in the process of understanding it, which required them to simultaneously update 2 things at once: their picture of the woman who had been sitting at their edge for the past hour, and their picture of the reason a team like this one would spend time looking for her. He didn't explain. He didn't turn to the group and provide context, didn't introduce her in the way that would have given them the narrative structure they would have needed to process it comfortably. He wasn't there to give the group a story. He was there for her. The rest of the room, its composition, its assumptions, the specific architecture of social positioning that had placed her at its periphery, was not a variable he had any reason to engage with. She looked at him for a moment, the brief, grounded look of someone recognizing something they had been expecting without being certain when it would arrive. She didn't look surprised, not because she was performing composure, because this, or something shaped like this, was a category of thing that had happened before. The call that arrives to the right channel, to the right person, because the situation has produced a requirement that routes to a specific kind of expertise, and that expertise happens to be hers. She stood. She didn't say anything to the group before she left. There was no pause at the edge of the departure where she might have offered the correction that the situation had now made available. The account of what nurse had meant and what it hadn't, the precision that the single word had left out. She owed them nothing that she hadn't already given, which was her honest answer to a question that hadn't been asked with enough depth to receive more than she'd provided. She picked up her jacket. She left with the team the way people leave when the reason for leaving has arrived, and the leaving is simply the next step in a sequence that has its own logic. Without drama, without the backward look of someone wanting to be seen departing, without any of the performance that the moment might have entitled her to perform. The door closed. The group held the particular stillness of people who have just had a social environment reconfigured around them without warning. The specific quality of quiet that follows a revelation that arrived too late to change what had already been said and done inside the assumptions it corrected. One of them looked at the chair she had been sitting in, not at the door, not at the team that had just left with her, at the chair, as if reviewing the preceding conversation from the specific vantage point of having it play back against an updated picture of the person who had been sitting in it. The stories told, the details shared, the assessments made about what was relevant and what wasn't, and who in the room was positioned to understand the difference. Nobody said anything. There was nothing to say that the room hadn't already said to itself. The chair was empty in the way objects become charged when they've been vacated by someone whose presence you didn't fully register until they were no longer there. A seat that had held someone peripheral, someone easy to move past, someone defined and categorized and set aside before the defining had been earned. The problem isn't what people are. It's how quickly others decide they already know. Because sometimes the most important person in the room is the one no one thought to ask. The chair sat empty. The assumption that had been built around it had not survived the evening, and the person who had sat in it was already somewhere else, doing the thing that had made her the answer to a question the room hadn't known was being asked. Subscribe to Steel Heart Stories, Emma, for more stories where the truth doesn't need to prove itself.